Good morning. Go through the sick list before we get to our Bible study. Brother Doug's dad is home and a little bit weak, but need to keep that family in our prayers. Jessica's on the mend. Priscilla, excuse me. Had the wrong thing come in my head. Keep the Moody's in mind. Keep Brother Terry in mind. Tina. Update on Holly. She has had her MRI and they have read that. She has a bulging disc in the lumbar region and also 3 bulging discs in, not bulging, but 3 bone spurs in the cervical region, the neck area. So need to keep her in our thoughts. They've got getting set up for other doctor appointments now, so hopefully it won't be too long before they can remedy that. Anyone I have missed? Oh, Beverly is visiting with new grandchild, and Sister Dot, her next appointment's in a couple of weeks, so they can decide a course of treatment for her. So we need to keep the Fullers in our prayers also. I'm sorry? That's correct. I got an email from Jackie yesterday. Seemed like the whole Conyers family is down with whatever's going around. Brother Jim, would you lead us in a prayer then before we begin?
Father, we're thankful for this morning that you bless us with, for the opportunity that you've given each and every one of us to gather and to study your word and worship you. For Heavenly Father, that we do so with an open mind and open hearts. We do this standing only on your word. We're mindful of those who are mentioned this morning who are sick, who are homesick, who are struggling with their health, those who are undergoing tests. We pray that they will be restored to their health and the doctors and nurses will do the things necessary to restore them. Again, be with us now as we go into our class. We know we do and say things that we shouldn't do, that commit those sins in our lives. I pray that as we begin this morning that you forgive us of those sins so that our hearts and minds will be ready. In Jesus' name, amen.
I did forget one, Ricky May with his heart condition. Keep him in prayers too. Okay, today we're going to start, we'll be in chapter 4 of Matthew and also chapter 1 of John. But before we get there, we're only going to be 4 chapters deep into the New Testament if we started with Matthew. And we have already covered a long period of time in a person's life, relatively long. Well, we're already up to about the 30th year of Christ, depending on how you number and count things. We're going to say round about that time period, because he has been baptized. Well, he was born, fled to Egypt, grown up. We don't know much about his growing up time. And then he was baptized by John the Baptist, and now we're about to pick up with him, about to journey off and start his teaching and ministry on earth. And how do you, now we know God is God, Christ is God, but how do you suppose that he came up with the original disciples that he did, those that were going to be his apostles? Now he knows everything that's going on already, but how do you suppose that he selected those people? And let me back up just a little bit and ease into it this way. In the Matthew account, he's walking by the Sea of Galilee and he sees 2 people and says, "Hey, come with me." Was it that simple? We're going to start in the book of John because I think and this is me personally now, I think this is the way things blend in. If you go to John chapter 1, and start with verse 35. It says, "And the next day after John stood and two of his disciples," whose disciples? John's disciples. Because what was John's role? Pardon? He was to prepare the way. So here are two of John's disciples, and looking upon Jesus as he walked, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And the two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned and saw them, and saith unto them, "What seek ye?" They said unto him, "Rabbi," which is to say, being interpreted, "Master, where dwellest thou?" He said unto them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first findeth his own brother Simon, and saith unto him, "We have found the Messiah," which is being interpreted, the Christ. Now, if we had put Matthew first in this lineup, and he had gone down by the Sea of Galilee and found Peter and Andrew, this part wouldn't make any sense, would it? So if we start here, what apparently has happened is that John's disciples saw Jesus. John pointed out Jesus to them. They went and learned a little bit, and now when we get to the Matthew account, he walks by and he sees them and says, "Come on," because they just drop everything they're doing at that point and follow him. But let's back up a verse. In verse 39, he said, "Come and see." They came and saw where he dwelt, and abode with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. What is the 10th hour of the day as we're looking at it here? About 4 p.m.? You're using Jewish time. What time would it have been if they'd been using Roman time? 10 a.m. So how do we know if it was 10 a.m. or 4 p.m.? And what difference does it make? To me, it makes no difference, but there are a lot of people that try to find little things like this, little details, and point them out and try to make a great big deal out of it. The only reason I mention this is my granddaughter is getting real interested. I think partly thanks to you and all. She's doing a lot of inquiring about Bible facts and all. And when she come to the 10th hour, she wanted to know how the Jews counted time. And we got into, started at night like they did. When the sun goes down, we got into the 4 watches, and then the next day into the hours of the day. And she says, "But what if they wanted them to come over at 7 o'clock at night?" That's during the first watch, but the first watch included 3 hours. So she couldn't understand. I didn't spend a whole bunch of time with it. I just mentioned it a time or two because she was really going deep into a couple other areas. But you see, we get hung up on little things like that because what are we addicted to today? Time. Right now, when I was growing up, we had analog clocks, watches, things of that nature. And when somebody asked you what time to get up, you said, "Oh, about 4 o'clock. Today, with digital, you look up 4:44. You'll be amazed how many times Andrew and I get in bed at 11:11. But we are so hung up on time that we cannot go back and look at the first century when Christ was walking about. They relatively didn't care about time. How did they tell time in the first century? Basically, daylight or dark. They knew it was midday. They knew it was sunrise, sunset, midday, so they got a vague idea of what was going on. How'd they tell time at night? Well, there was a way. Today, Well, let me ask you this. I just want to put you on the spot. What phase of the moon are we in today? Pardon? Pardon? New. We are at a new moon. One person in here even knew anything about the nighttime. Most of us don't look at the moon. Was it a week or two ago that we was driving along and saw the moon and you said waxing? How many of you in here know what the definition when you're looking at the moon, waxing and waning, mean? Exactly. You start at the new moon, and from the new moon to the full moon, we are waxing, and from the full moon to the new moon, we're waning. You see, people back in those days, when all they had was the moon and stars, if there was no clouds in the sky, they could get a pretty good idea of the time of night. It was about 250 or so BC that they came up with the sundial so they could tell time during the day. And it was about 100 years later, somewhere around 160 or so BC, that they come up with a water clock that was semi-accurate so they could tell time at night. But they didn't care. We shouldn't either. The only thing that we need to know is about the 10th hour, these two came, they followed Jesus, and they had a nice long talk with him. Yes, sir. Well, I don't, again, it doesn't matter, but here's my, it could have been Roman time because the Romans captured Jerusalem about 6 decades before Christ was born. Somewhere around 63 or 64 BC is when Rome expanded into that area. So for going on 60 to 90 years, they had been under Roman rule, and they very easily could be looking at the Roman time. But I personally believe that they're on Jewish time, and the reason I believe that is because how did the Jews and the Romans get along? They didn't cohabitate. They did what? They coexisted. The difference is that the Jewish people still had their own set of laws. They had their own thing, and they had to get along with the Romans just to exist. But they still had, they wouldn't eat with them, they wouldn't do things with them, they didn't interact with them. So it's my personal opinion that they're on Jewish time. But like I say, it could be Roman, but it really makes no difference at that point, does it? That's where they found themselves. Now, let's go back to Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 4, and we're going to pick up at verse 18. And I believe, if you remember, that they had at least had a meeting with them at this point, because in verse 18 it says, "And Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee." First off, so there's no confusions, how many other names does the Sea of Galilee have? Probably at least 3, right? Can you name them? You can't pronounce them. You can read them, but you can't pronounce them. One of them was Tiberias. Well, Gennesareth was one, and Chinnereth was one. So that's at least three names that we have for the Sea of Galilee. But Jesus was walking, and he saw 2 brethren, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said unto them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they straightway left their nets and followed him. Now, like I say, they just immediately threw down all their equipment, left it in the boat, and started off. So I believe that this passage that we looked at in John sort of set the scene for that. It wasn't that Christ was a stranger to them. They knew that had John, if John had not been preparing the way, and what does preparing, we've talked about what preparing the way meant, but if we look at it this way, that he had even prepared a few of the people that was going to transition over to Christ and be with him initially. To me, that is preparing the way also. So here, and what does it mean by followed him? If I ask you, if I say, John, come down here, I need to show you something, he's going to follow me down to what I show him, but then what's he going to do? Okay, I see it, and he's going to turn around and go back. Follow him here means that he's going to follow Christ's doctrine and his teaching. And like we as Christians, what do we follow? We follow God. We follow the Bible, not necessarily just following his physical tracts, but they're going to follow him all the way. And going on from thence, he saw other two brethren, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in a ship with Zebedee their father, mending their net, and he called them. And they immediately left the ship and their father and followed him. So, would they have just dropped what they was doing if they didn't know a little bit about what was going on? Probably not, but it's possible, and Jesus could have done anything he wanted to. He could have dropped a little inspiration on them at that point if he wanted to, but he was trying to get people to follow him. How? Willingly follow. So the people that he's picking out here to start with, I believe, had a little insight as to what was going on and had been prepared a little bit. And here they follow him immediately. And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. We need to pause here a minute and talk about synagogue, because where were the Jewish people directed in the Old Testament to go and worship? Jerusalem, temple. Sacrifices were to be made in the temple, but as things go along in the synagogues, you won't find where sacrifices are being done in the synagogues. The sacrifices are still done in temples, but in the synagogues is where they met to read the law and basically do some worshiping and some teaching. And here is where Christ goes to meet with them because he knows there's going to be an assembly. Now, until Rome conquered them in about 60, I think it was 64, it might have been 63 AD. At one point, before Rome came in and conquered them, there had been over 480 synagogues in Jerusalem. Now, why is that important? What is required for there to be a synagogue? And that would be that at least 10 men would take on the responsibility. If there was only 9, they had to do something different. But if they had 10 men that would run it the way it was supposed to be run, then they could have a synagogue. And so Jesus went around meeting in synagogues, because why would you want to meet at a synagogue instead of a street corner? It used to be more prevalent than it is today that you would be walking, when we had downtowns instead of malls everywhere. When you was walking downtown, it was not uncommon to walk by and there'd be somebody on the street. Linda's grinning at me, she knows. It was not uncommon to have somebody standing on a street corner thumping out Bible verses, right? How much attention did they get? Almost none, very little. But what would happen if that same person had chosen to go to a church building? Show up a little early. How often do we have people come in early that's traveling through because they don't know our times or anything? You can talk about Bible with them, and they're very interested. So he was meeting with those. There's an old saying, and I used this a lot when I was in the Air Force, and I'm sure Brother John will also. When you go in and see things that need changing, what do you change first? You start with the easy and work to the hard. We call it low-hanging fruit. You pick the low-hanging fruit first, and then you work your way to the more difficult things as you want to make changes through the line. So who is it easier for Christ to reach here? And who is he trying to reach? Jews first, and then the Gentiles. So who is the most receptive? Would he have been better off going to the Sanhedrin Council? No, because they were what? Power hungry, legalistic. Would it have been better going to the high priest? High priest didn't want to give up power, so who was he trying to reach? The common Jew, the one that would be receptive. So that's why he went to the synagogue and preached the gospel of the kingdom and healing all manner of sickness and all people of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria. Now, again, people get hung up on this, wanting to know the border of Syria at this time. And from the multitude of maps that I have looked at, there's no agreement. It was Syria, and we know Rome had come in and was taken over, so the exact boundaries we don't know, but in general, it had to be between the Mediterranean Sea and what river? The Jordan. And from the north to the south, we don't know. So in that general area, but it says that his fame went throughout all Syria. That's just like I was talking to a fellow many years ago, and he told me, he said, we are the first generation that has been able to spread the gospel to the whole world. I said, why do you say that? He said, because we've got satellite communication. We've got all this going on. So we are the first. And I said, well, what about Colossians, when Paul says that he had preached to all Christians? He said, well, that was the then known world. So he is dividing up based on his theory that time. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, the Aborigine in Australia, most of them still don't have satellite comm. So how are we reaching them? So, but that just shows you where people try to go with things like that. But he's reaching all the sick people that were taking divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatics, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. We can also get into a discussion about possessed with devils, because demon possession is even today a hot topic. There are a lot of people today that believe in the spirit world, the haunted houses, ghosts, demons, and all those things. In the first century, when Christ was on the earth, and it says devil possessed, was that figurative or was that literal? Were people possessed back in those days versus not now? I personally believe it was literal also, because during that, as just the same way as miracles happened then that don't happen now, that was one of the methods of proving what was going on and proving who they were. And if it was not literal, how come Christ had conversations with them? And when they came out, they went into hogs and went into the river and such. So we have to understand the same as the clock and day and night and the watches now. We are in a different time than 2,000 years ago. So, and there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee and from Decapolis. One word about Decapolis here, that appears to be a region of 10 cities. Decapolis means 10. So it's apparently from a region of 10 cities, and from Jerusalem, from all Judea, and from beyond Jordan. So as Christ had picked up a few of his disciples that would later be apostles, and as he was going along the way preaching and teaching, he was assembling a great multitude, and all things were getting off to a pretty good start. Questions or comments on Matthew? Because now we're going to go back to John and pick up on where we left off in John. John chapter 1. We had left off at verse 41. We'll pick up at 42. And he brought him to Jesus, and when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. So Simon the son of Jonah is called Peter and also Cephas. The day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee and find Philip, and saith unto him, Follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, and the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip findeth Nathanael, and saith unto him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, Come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and said of him, well, before we get there, let me just pause for a second and see if you have any questions or comments on where we are to this point, now that he has started gathering those that he wanted close to him. Now, Nathanael had asked the question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And here, when Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, he said, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile. See, Jesus knew everything, so he knew who Nathanael was and knew Nathanael's character. And Nathanael answered and said unto him, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. Jesus answered and said unto him, Because I said unto thee, I saw thee under the fig tree. Believest thou? Thou shalt see greater things than these. I think I skipped something. Yeah. Back up to 48. Nathanael saith unto him, Whence knowest thou me? And Jesus answered and said unto him, Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee. So here, Nathanael is beginning to believe because Christ is telling him a little something about himself, that he had seen him under the fig tree. And in verse 51, and he saith unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Now, when Christ told Nathanael, or when Christ saw Nathanael and said, Behold, an Israelite indeed, whom is no guile, exactly what was he talking about Nathanael? He wasn't doing it for show. He wasn't a fake. When Christ saw him under the fig tree, if we can draw some suppositions, he was probably meditating or praying Because why else would he say he saw him under the fig tree? Why would he put a location on it if he hadn't seen him doing something that would be representative of who he was? But Christ knew that he was a real, well, first off, he was an Israelite, but moreover than that, he was religious. He was no guile found in him. He was truly one. Questions or comments on John? Okay, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. And in Matthew chapter 9, we're going to start about, well, where did we start in Matthew 9? We're going to start at verse 9, but before we start at verse 9, we're going to back up a little bit. We're going back up to verse 4. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, wherefore think ye evil in your hearts, for whether is easier to say, well, never mind. Let's not do that. That was something else. Let's just start with verse 9. And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom, and he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. Matthew was what profession? Tax collector. Think he had a little money? Probably, because tax collectors back in those days got a little share. So he was probably wealthy, as we'll find out from him later on. But let's also look at Luke here. This will be a good time to look at Luke. Luke 5. Luke 5. And someone read verses 27 through 32. Luke 5, 27 through 32. Okay. In this, and in the Luke version, his name is Levi. But in the Matthew version, his name is Matthew. What we need to look at here for just a second is that it was not uncommon for people to have a multitude of names, very similar to the Egyptians. Most Egyptians, the pharaohs and all, they had 6, 7, 8 names that they went by. So here they had several names. But I like the Luke account of that, because when it said that, well, the Matthew account said he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of customs, meaning it's a tax place collecting taxes. It says he arose and followed him. Luke account says he did what? Gave up everything and followed him. Why would Luke say that he gave up everything and Matthew account only say that he followed? I think it might go a little bit deeper than that. Who's writing Matthew? Matthew. If Matthew had said, I gave up everything to follow him, would it not sound a little bit like bragging? Whereas another person looked at it and said, hey, he sacrificed everything. Supposition on my part, but anyway, he gave up everything. And it came to pass as Jesus sat at meat in the house. Whose house? Matthew's house. Behold, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And John had just read verse 29 on that of Luke 5. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, Why eateth your master with publicans and sinners? And when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. And then pay attention to the next verse. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. Today, I think that a lot of times people try to use where it says, the Bible tells us that we are a peculiar people and we're to be of the world, but not in the world, but not of the world. They come in and they want to make the division right down the line that you can't have anything to do with anybody that is not of your group. Well, this sort of sounds like Amish and a few others, but there is a distinct, it might be a fine line, but there is a distinct difference between associating with someone and doing what with someone? Fellowshipping with someone. There is a distinct difference. And how can you even attempt to convert somebody if you don't have anything to do with them? So, to me, the fellowship part, or where the fine line is that you don't endorse their bad behavior, you don't participate in their bad behavior, but you still have to come in contact with them, or else you hadn't got a clue on how to reach them. And this is, in my opinion, this is exactly what Christ is telling the Pharisees when he said, go learn what that means. And then he follows it up with, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, for I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So he followed it up with the reason why that was. Questions or comments on that section? Brother Conch, I'm not getting any conversation. I'm not going to leave you much to talk about Wednesday night. Okay. Well, I do. I agree with you that there was probably some familiarity with some, if not all of those to start with. Matthew had probably been an exception because he was in a different profession, but we know for a fact that Peter, Andrew, James, and John were what? Fishermen. They had their own boats, or at least Zebedee had one for James and John. But I used to fish a whole lot. And when I got down to the lake or river where I was going to lunch, there was a multitude of times where my partner and I would look and say, oh, there's so-and-so's vehicle. even though we were not friends, we participated in the same activities, so we had a knowledge of who was who. We was even sitting out on the river and heard a boat one day and said, "Oh, that sounds like," and sure enough, it was them, and they sidled over and talked to us for a while. So at least those four been in the same profession and probably within walking distance of where Jesus was when he recruited them. Uh, they were familiar with each other. And with them already talking to John the Baptist, they had a little bit of knowledge going on that way. So, and I believe that's why even Philip, it mentioned that he was from the same town. So uh, I think there's a connection. And I think if you look at it from where I started in John, not John, yeah, the book of John, with John the Baptist, I think a lot of times people want to cut him short and say, well, he come and prepared the way, and then leave it at that. And they don't look at how, what I call that transition. At least two of John's disciples became disciples of Christ. So there was some, to me, that's the real preparing the way part. Oh, absolutely.
Peter and John are following Jesus, who is not trial. John just walks right on in, kind of recircles him. He had to go back to the door and say, "Hey, Peter's with me."
Mm-hmm.
So he was in that inner circle. And then you had the other side, like you said, Matthew was tax collector. Simon was elevated business of getting rid of people who were tax collectors. So it's pretty diverse. And if you look at the history record, they all dispersed in areas that kind of fit their personality, and they excelled. So all throughout the Great Commission. So it's pretty interesting. Right, exactly.
And I think that's where I was trying to get to was when I asked the question, how did he select these particular ones? He didn't do it in a haphazard manner. He did it with a plan. Brother Terry? I don't know if he said show me your books or not, but they probably had at least come in contact with them, getting their revenue from them. So, okay. We've got about a minute left here. Anything else? Brother Golden? Yes, sir. Correct. Yes, sir. Like I said, it was not uncommon for them to have several names that they went by. Anything else?
Matthew, first we call Matthew. He wrote Matthew, and it's called Matthew. Not Levi. That's another one of the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, let's start with chapter 10 of Matthew then. This is, well, no, we're not going to get there. Where did he find the rest of the disciples? Because when we get to chapter 10, they will list the 12, but how many did we list that where he found and said, come follow me? About half of them. Where'd the other half come from? It doesn't get into that, but what we do find in chapter 10 that we're going to get to is that chapter 10 and verse 2 or 3, it starts listing all of them. And then as we go from there, we learn a little bit about each of them as we go on down the line. Matthew 10, which we won't get to, but starting in verse 2, it says, list of 12 names of them. So appreciate your attention, appreciate your comments, and Brother Terry will hopefully have a little bit to talk about Wednesday night. He can go over and cover things I didn't cover too. Thank y'all.